Hi, and welcome to this Rule of Carnage review of, in this case, Mars Code Aurora. Mars Code Aurora was written by Sami Maronier and Hugo Minus Nives. Sorry for mangling anybody's names there. But Hugo is a member of our Discord. And so sent this copy of Mars Code Aurora through to me just as a preview copy, just because they follow the channel. So I've given a look over, and I'm going to do a little bit of a delve into some of the rules elements, run through a bit of an overview, and talk through the game. Talking of which, I guess we'll go straight on to the Okay, so Mars Code Aurora, I believe, was originally released in 2020 in, I think, a French language version, and has a very strong following in France. It's now being essentially re-released by Studio Tomahawk and North Star Figures in this current edition. It's a very much miniatures agnostic, kind of faction agnostic, narrative level sci-fi skirmish game. So essentially you have 8 generic factions called things like order or brutality or something of that nature to sort of suggest the overall idea of that faction. You select the one that you think sort of suits most naturally to the force and the minis that you've decided to use within the game. That gives you a sort of faction specific overarching rule, and gives you access to certain sorts of troops and specialists. You then take a relatively small force, sort of 8 to 12 models roughly, depending on sort of which bits and pieces you're choosing to take. And as I say, it's sort of quite narrative level in its focus. One of the things I always feel is a badge of something being like narrative level is whether or not it has climbing and falling rules for the minis, and it has climbing and falling rules. It has things like sort of generic actions for healing, which is also, I think, quite a badge of something being quite sort of narrative and focused in on the detail. It's quite scenario driven, so you end up sort of selecting scenarios, and it is about sort of objective driven play rather than just sort of inherently killing each other off. Play wise, it's quite brutal. Certainly, close combat is extremely brutal. It's more a game about positioning, setting up ambushes, finding cover, finding sort of openings for the right moment, rather than sort of running through hails of bullets, having them sort of ping off your mighty warriors and blasting back with massive salvos. It's I would say that the sort of the minis are quite sort of fragile. If you get sort of a clean shot on somebody, certainly the infantry troopers. So you have categories of infantry that go up sort of through to basic, elite, and sort of power armored super elite. You also have walkers and sort of mechanicals of one or another kind, and you have vehicles. And certainly the lowest level infantry can get blown away pretty quickly, and certainly cut to pieces very fast in close combat, certainly if you're unprepared. So yeah, I think it's sort of quite tactical in its play, and about being sort of quite careful about where and how you engage, and that's, I would say, it's much more sort of objective driven. Background wise, as I say, it is designed to be sort of generic to a degree. It's designed to be very, very sort of miniatures agnostic. Miniatures agnosticism is definitely sort of baked into the system. It does have a background of its own, as you might have guessed from the title. It's about sort of an attempted colonization of Mars. There are these sort of arcs of the colonists, one of which is sort of crash landed, broken down, as it were, and the different sort of factions on the arc have split up, and they're the general factions. And then there are these sort of drones from the security systems, which we'll get onto in a minute. In fact, we'll get onto relatively soon because we're going to move on to Mars Code Aurora does quite a few unusual things, ranging from the quite peculiar through to the fairly usual. But it has a lot of interesting ideas in a good way that not every sort of single skirmish miniatures game does. So I'm just going to sort of touch on some of them because I think these are probably the sorts of things that might sort of give you to decide that you'd be interested in the system. The first thing, and it's right on the back of the book as you read it. A rule system lets you play with any kind of dice you like. So essentially, in Code Aurora, all dice are just a 50-50 pass fail. So you take any given dice, you halve the faces, half of the faces are successes, half the faces are fails, and you can do that on odds and evens or halfway up numerically. Obviously, if you do have those weird little D3, that would be the one dice that you couldn't actually use to play Code Aurora, but any other given sort of dice. I mean, you could literally play this with pocket change and split it between heads and tails. That's sort of all the system cares about in relation to the dice themselves. And then it's about sort of the size of dice pools and the sort of level of number of successes that are required. So rather than it even being a dice pool with a single target number, it's rather a dice pool that requires X many successes to be successful. So, for example, a test might be to roll 3 dice. 2 or more successes is a pass. 1 or fewer successes is a failure. So it's an interesting system, certainly for if you are sort of a committedly dice agnostic player as well as being a miniatures agnostic player. For me, it feels like a system where a realization has been reached that you don't happen to be using target numbers that require a specific dice. And it feels like a designer that's gone, oh, look, we don't happen to care whether it's a D6 or a D8 or a D10, where every time doing sort of 50-50, let's just let people use what they want. We may as well do that, which I think shows to me sort of a mind that's looking at what they're doing as they're designing. But anyway, it's an interesting, fun little quirk for the game. Another thing that does that not every single skirmish minis game does, but some do, is it has a sort of an order system. So each unit, so you pick a collection of miniatures, and each individual miniature activates individually. You have essentially an action point, which can be used for a variety of actions, and a free action point, which has to be movement. And then on top of that, officers can give additional action points to other troops. So if you have an officer with a rating of 3, they can give essentially 3 additional actions to other infantry, let's say, around them. So there is a level of sort of having a command structure and a command range, and sort of using your commanders interestingly. Also, it has reactive orders, so you can move and shoot and etc., or you can use an order to go into essentially Overwatch, or a close combat sort of charge-based Overwatch where you'll intercept people as they come into range, and a few bits and pieces like that. An interesting sort of emergent property of that, I guess, possibly, is so one of the orders you can take is a sort of suppressive fire. But rather than it being a form of like pinning, which might take away actions or abilities of another miniature or activation, which can lead to sort of stalemates and moments of nothing. The suppressing fire in Mars Code Aurora removes the reaction ability that another miniature might have put onto it. So I think that's a nice idea. I think it's always a good idea to have things like sort of wounding fire options. I think it's a nice option to have a non-wounding fire option that doesn't remove actions, but in many ways maybe sort of pushes people towards being a bit more proactive, because if you're just having your sort of sit back reaction abilities removed by the suppressing fire, you're going to have to sort of move in and be more active. So again, I think that's a sort of a nice and intelligent way of sort of using a reactive fire ability. I think it's a nice, intelligent way of sort of playing with the pace of the game and the way that the game works. So the last of the sort of interesting and unusual things, which at least one other sort of game does, I'd like to mention, is the activation system. So this is very interesting, and it relates a little bit back to something I teased in the previous section, and that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next section. But at the start of the game, essentially, you build an activation deck. And what that deck is one card for each of your units, one card for each of your opponent's units, and 3 patrol cards. And you shuffle these up, and at the start of each turn, you pull a card, and that's who gets to activate a unit. So say it does exist in at least one kind of game, because it reminds me it's relatively similar to the Test of Honor chit pull bag system, particularly insofar as if you get those 3 patrol cards, that ends the turn. So not necessarily everybody is going to get to activate everything. One way that it differs, I think, significantly from Test of Honor is that you don't take out the sort of the activating elements as units die off. So what that means is that in the later turns of the game, you're more likely to have all of the units on the table activating in a given turn, and in the earlier turns of the game, you're more likely to have some of them cut out. So obviously that shifts your tactical sort of intentions. In the earlier game sort of turns, you're going to be prioritizing getting certain things done and leaving certain things sort of knowing that they might not be achievable. It also means that survivors or more hardened troops are sort of going to get ultimately more activations throughout the game, because they're going to survive through to the point where everyone's getting activated. So I think it's quite an interesting system. I think it's a nice system because it's a version of the bag pull and initiative system that's taking some tweaks on other sort of systems, other ways of doing this, but it's totally something you can sort of construct yourself with a standard deck of cards, and it gives a lot of that sort of variety, that variation. It's got a real sort of tactical interest to it. I think it's a very nice system. I very much enjoy the idea of it, and I think it's quite an elegant system as well. And in relation to that being a thing that I like about the game, and I like a lot of these things about the game, but I think that's a particularly nice one, I'm going to move on to a couple of specifics in this section. So specifically two very specific rules that I really, really like about this. One of them is just it's just one specific rule within one part of the game, and I like it enough that I'm going to actually read it out. So it is the aim of a miniature game is to have a good time, not to quibble for hours over details. If there's any debate about whether line of sight is valid, granted. Similarly, if there's any doubt about cover, then count the target as being in cover. I want to bring that up because, first of all, obviously, it's a sort of rule I enjoy. It sounds a little bit like the rule of Carnage. I don't think necessarily that there's a relationship between the two, but I know the mindset that sort of causes someone to put that sort of rule together. It's a nice rule in that it's an argument fixer. It speeds life up at the tabletop. It's not a rule that just says games are about having fun, so just all have fun, because people's opinions differ on what that means. In all honesty, and whilst trying to be fun people, it's specific about what you should do when there is a debate. But what I particularly enjoy about it, and what makes it different from the rule of Carnage, is that if you see, it goes two slightly different ways dependent upon the situation, both of which are about encouraging play, if you see what I mean. So if you're looking to see if something is in line of sight, it is in line of sight because we're encouraging you to do shooting to engage. But if you're not sure whether something is in cover, it is in cover because we're encouraging you to find cover. It encourages you to try to do things in the movement phase as defensively and to try to do things aggressively. It's an encouraging, it's a pushing to engage with the game system. It defaults to rewarding the person who has actually attempted to engage with things, which I think makes it a particularly beautiful rule. It's a tiny rule. It's just within the system generally. It's not boxed out. It doesn't have like a special title. It's not an overview rule. But I personally wish it were. It's a great rule that says a lot about the intention. And for me, it's one of those rules that, even though it's on page 16, it's bolded, but it's not boxed out. It's one of those rules I looked at, just went, okay, yeah, I get it. I like that. I love that. I wish you'd made a sort of a bigger thing of it. So the other thing that I want to particularly highlight about the game, and it's a sort of a much bigger sort of thematic, fireworks factory of a rule in many ways, and it's something that has sort of been mentioned to a degree in each of the systems, is an idea of these things called drones within the game. So as I suggested, so Mars Code Aurora is a sort of crashed arc that has these sort of security systems that are part of the arc, which are essentially untouchable. I mean, not essentially, they are untouchable, they're unkillable, they're fully indestructible. And these drones that float around the battlefield. And they are what is represented by those patrol cards I mentioned within the activation system. And basically, what the drones are sort of floating null zones on the battlefield. So they move around the battlefield, and when you pull a patrol card, you move them about, and control of them can pass from player to player. So you're the active player if your activation card is pilled, and then you activate a unit, and then you remain the active player when you pull the next card to see who becomes the next active player. And if you pull a patrol card within that moment, you are then controlling that patrol and then that drone, and then we pull another card, we find out who the new active player is. So the drones move around and they don't attack anything necessarily, but wherever they go, within a zone around it, no one can fight, no one can fire any weapons, no one can attack, because this sort of indestructible super drone is presumably going to laser beam you from the sky, or just turn off weapons, or some sort of future tech reason that you absolutely cannot fight while they're around. And that, I think, for me, is a super fascinating thing to have put into the game. Obviously, my sort of gut reaction when I first sort of read that rule is that feels like a floating no fun zone. If it's something flying around going, no, 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 you're not going to use some of your stuff. But I think in actuality, it's a very interesting sort of moving tactical option changing zone on the tabletop, because as I mentioned before, there are things like everyone has generic healing actions. So, everyone has sort of a basic level of medic that they're kind of carrying around with themselves. So, there's non-zone for fighting drops on you. What do you do? Do you find cover? Do you heal? Do you engage with the objective? Because these are objective driven missions. Do you use that floating sort of null zone as something to allow you to get from cover to cover. Because remember, this is a quite brutal and deadly game if you run into fire, but you have these 3 floating sort of anti-fire zones that can be moved around the tabletop. So it's a way of leveling out the brutality of the shooting. It's a way of, again, underlining, along with the objectives, that this is not a game about, gun lining each other to pieces and just, killing until everybody's dead. It's a game about sort of strategy and movement within a deadly sort of zone, but whilst finding ways to sort of get around that deadliness and be active on the tabletop and find your spots. And so for me, I really like it because it's a rule that I had questions about when I first started reading it, and then I realized, okay, what the point of it and how it interacts with the universe of the game and the full set of mechanics. And I think it's actually a really, really interesting rule. It's a thing that really sort of lays on an overarching sort of framework to the game that isn't like every other skirmish miniatures game, because there's a lot of good stuff in the rest of this, but without that, it would fundamentally be an objective driven narrative skirmish game with some nice mechanics and some nice ideas, but it wouldn't necessarily feel super different on the tabletop. And it is always tricky when you're writing a generic miniatures agnostic game. And then the idea of these drones very much, I feel, sets it within a specific generic universe, if you know what I mean. And it gives an interesting sort of strategies and tactics, and it really mixes up this. Because of that, I think, more than almost anything else, this isn't going to feel like any other minis game that you're going to play. It's really going to mix things up. It's really going to change the strategy and the tactics. And I think that's probably, and I think there's a lot of reasons in this, again, as I say, but I think that might be one of the big things, the reason this has, as I say, a very healthy following already. It just doesn't happen to be a particularly English speaking healthy following at the moment, and I think it definitely deserves one. It's a really clever system. I don't know if you can sort of see, it's a fairly tiny book. It's 84 pages, which is not massive. That's sort of a little over the Osprey Blue books, or possibly now that they're sort of extending their page count, basically an Osprey Blue book, and it's in a larger page format. But it's not a massive book. This isn't a honking great big tome to get through. This took me a couple of days to sort of really ingest, and that is with, as I say, although it's setting generic, it has its own setting, so it has lore pages. So just to say, for example, this is factions, lore, and optional or alternative rules. The core rules themselves are about 40 pages. This is a slim volume, but it does a lot of smart things in the space that it's given. It understands where to tweak a system. It understands where to put in interesting things. It understands what things it doesn't care about. And I think generally this is one of the things I'm always interested in a given game design. If a game tries to care about everything, they tend to fall to pieces somewhere or another, or they just tend to be completely unwieldy at the tabletop. This is a game that knows what it's not too bothered about, and it knows not to sort of focus on those, and instead to make good the things it wants to make good. It makes good, really good, I think, the things it wants to make good. And I think that dice system I was talking about in many ways exemplifies that. That's a moment of a designer going, I don't care about sort of multiple target number modifiers. I'm just not bothered. That's not what this game is. It's a game about sort of, taking your shooting value, taking off your defense value, and that's the numbers, of dice that get rolled, or the number of the successes that are needed. Something quite simple and punchy, and we chuck some dice and we move on with that. And so it's stepped out some of those things it doesn't care about, and it's made things it does care about really good in a really, really short number of pages. I think that if you're looking for a miniatures agnostic sci-fi system, a setting largely agnostic sci-fi system, I definitely recommend picking this up. I think that particularly if you want something narrative, and I think the interesting about the thing about this, although like I say, it does have its own inbuilt setting, it I think this would be a really nice cyberpunk system. The idea of the drones being the sort of law enforcement of the city, anything that's sort of untouchable from the viewpoint of the combatants. I think this would work really, really nicely for. As I say, it's sort of small skirmish levels. It's about the fact that your guys die fairly easily if they get shot up. It's about finding cover. It has these floating drones. I think it should reskin so elegantly into a sort of a cyberpunk system or a dystopian sort of urban future. I like the idea of the Mars-based setting, but you know, if you've got a bunch of sort of not red terrain, you know, I think there are some nice reskins. And again, even within this slim volume at the back, they've got a handful of sort of alternative reskinnable ways of reskinning the setting, which is it's a beautiful way of sort of thinking about the system. There's a few pages where they sort of say, okay, if you're looking for this sort of setting, do this with this faction and do that with that faction, use these guys and these guys, tweak this, tweak that, which is brilliant. It's somebody who knows that they're a sort of setting agnostic system, even though they've quite lovingly built a setting for it, and they're going, okay, going to help you out, going to give you a hand in resetting this to the system that you might be interested in. And we all know a few systems you might be interested in. So here's one. This one, this might be a bit like a thing that you already know. And so it's a brilliantly, intelligently written book. It's a book written by people who care to play games. It's written by people, I think, that understand the process of game design, you know, or at least designing this game very, very well. I think it's a really great set of rules. I think that it's a slim enough volume and a sort of easy enough to get into set of rules. You could pick this up and this could be, you know, a secondary game, something that you can try out and you can test, and it doesn't have to be your sort of your main game. But I think it's got plenty enough in there that this could sustain being the sort of the main sci-fi game you play. I think it's got tons of sort of intelligence in it, and I think it's something that's well worth coming back to. I think it's a good reason. It's got a strong following, and I hope to see that following grow with the sort of its UK release, and I think it fully deserves it. So that is a review of Mars Code Aurora. If you would like to see me doing more reviews, because this is the first review I've done of a rule set, if this is something you think you'd like to see more from the channel, please, 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 please drop into the comment section and let me know. If there's something you'd like to see me reviewing, particularly independent rule sets, unusual rule sets, things that don't get a lot of attention, please let me know. If you're sort of interested in a game like Mars Code Aurora, mention it in the comment section. If there's a particular mechanic that you saw me mention that you're curious about and you'd like a little more details about how it works in the game, let me know in the comments. I'll pop in there and sort of lay things out. Or you could just stop into the Discord where Minus is a member of the Rule of Carnage Discord, and I'm sure if you pop in there and ask about this system, they'll be delighted to talk to you about it, and sort of run through some of the inspirations and ideas behind it. While you're down in the comment section doing that, please do hit a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel to keep going. Other than that, from this Rule of Carnage review, it's going to be me saying thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye.